Well, we're starting right on time. This is wonderful. Hi, I'm Michael Scharf, for those of you who don't know me. It is so nice to see so many people who loved Henry King coming out for this. My job today is just to be a moderator and keep things going. And there are a lot of people on this program, and one of the things we're asking you to do is to keep your time really to 5 minutes, because otherwise we'll never get out of here. And there is an hour and a half. We have a reception and everything. So I will be a little bit strict about your time, and I'm sorry to have to do that on such an august occasion. But let me just begin by telling you that our very first speaker is the president of our university, a former colleague of Henry King's, and one of the law faculty, and we're very proud of her, and we're thankful that she came today. Barbara Snyder.
Thank you, Michael. Truly, it is an honor to be here this afternoon to remember one of the university's outstanding faculty members. In Henry King, our students, our staff, and our faculty have had the privilege of working side by side with a man who lived and shaped an unforgettable part of history. During his work at the Nuremberg trials, this 26-year-old attorney looked directly into the face of evil. He did not flinch. Instead, Henry took the lessons of his experience and forged them into a philosophy that shaped his life. Henry returned to the United States passionately committed to helping create a world where such atrocities would never happen again. He believed that the law and lawyers had a critical role to play in improving the lives of others, in assuring justice, in helping bring order where before there was none. Henry King returned from Nuremberg powerfully emboldened. He returned with full confidence that individuals of compassion and commitment, intellect and integrity could make a measurable difference in the world. As all of you gathered here today know well, he was right. We stand today in the school that was Professor King's home for more than a quarter century. At Case Western Reserve, Henry King played a pivotal role in the development of our programs in international law. He recruited faculty members and students. He helped launch the Canada-U.S. Law Institute when I was here the last time, and served as its chair for many years. Most of all, by word and deed, he illustrated the positive impact a man of laws could make. After Nuremberg, Professor King went on to serve as legal counsel for the United States in a foreign economic aid program during the Eisenhower administration that we all know as the Marshall Plan. He spent 2 decades as chief corporate international counsel for TRW. In the 1990s, he was part of the ABA's task force on war crimes in the former Yugoslavia. And in 1998, he and 2 colleagues from Nuremberg played a pivotal part in the creation of the International Criminal Court. The accomplishments are legion. So too is the affection he inspired among so many. Earlier this year, members of the Canada-U.S. Law Institute gathered with other colleagues and friends to honor Professor King. The remarks are included in an edition of the Institute's journal. I'll be surprised if anyone can read them without having some smiles, some tears, and a renewed sense of awe. This afternoon, however, I would like to close not with the words of one of his many admirers, and there are many, and you will be hearing from many of them today after I'm done. Even today, Henry King has so much to teach us. So let me leave you with his words, his remarks at the end of that dinner. I can leave you with one thought about what makes life worth living outside of love and affection. It is having ideals. I think you have got to have ideals to judge your progress. You never quite fulfill the ideals, or you get very close, but you grow in the process. It makes life worth living. I think you have to have hope. You've got to have dreams. And the real danger in life is not to dream at all. It is dreams that force change and a better world, and you grow in the process. That is what life is all about. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you, Professor King, for touching every last one of us with your work and by your example. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara. And now we'll hear from Bob Rawson, the interim dean of our law school and the former managing partner of Jones Day, one of the largest law firms, not just in the nation, but in the world.
Thank you, Michael. Welcome. Let me add my welcome to Michael's, to all of you for coming to our law school, which Henry King distinguished for so many years. Having just arrived as dean just last fall, less than a year ago, I didn't have the privilege and the pleasure that most of you had to know Henry well. On the other hand, having practiced law in this town for almost 4 decades, one couldn't do that without being aware of Henry King. And as a matter of fact, I did some work over the years for TRW, offering them some modest antitrust advice and some litigation help as well, while Henry was chief international counsel for TRW, so I rubbed elbows with Henry a bit during that period. But if you were in this city, and particularly as I came into this law school, it was clear to me just to walk these halls was to have a feel for Henry King and his influence on what we do here. Even in his 90th year, Henry would come in every day, or nearly every day, to meet his class in international arbitration virtually without missing a session. He was publishing articles. He participated in our conferences and even launched a brown bag lunch with students, which was a very popular session in which he shared a lifetime of insights with students. And Michael Scharf likes to describe this as his playing the role of the Dalai Lama of the law school in sharing the world as he knew it, and he knew a lot about that world. Somewhere in this room, somewhere in the vicinity, there are many copies of the 2009 volume of the Case Western Reserve Journal of International Law, which I encourage you to find those copies wherever they are, and to take one with you. You will find therein that this was a volume that Henry and a fellow Nuremberg prosecutor, Ben Ferenz, came up with the idea to include articles and a report from an experts meeting on the International Criminal Court and the crime of aggression. Henry's last article appears in the volume, and you'll also find therein a dedication to him. Perhaps foremost, though, and Barbara Snyder alluded to many of these things, Henry King was an institution builder, and it's for that, among other things, he will be remembered. He founded the Cleveland International Lawyers Group, which you'll hear about more from its former president, Chris Hunter, a little later. For 25 years, he built up our Canada-U.S. Law Institute, which will continue to be run at Case by visiting professors John Gretzinger and Dan Ujczo, whom you will also hear from today. But his contributions to the law school and beyond have been profound. When I first arrived here as interim dean, I talked with each of our colleagues on the faculty, but I was especially eager to spend some time with Henry King because I wanted to learn his perspectives. As I came in as dean, I asked him simple questions, as I asked others. What is it that he thought I should know or understand as I approached my task as dean, and what could I do to help him do what he was doing? And I had a wonderful conversation, engaging conversations with him, as you would expect. And you would expect also, you won't be surprised, Henry had opinions about what I should be doing. And he shared them with me, and occasionally our opinions were one-to-one. Occasionally we differed a bit, but we had a wonderful conversation about it. And at the close of it, he said to me, as only Henry could say, I know you'll do the right thing, and whatever you do, I will back you all the way, 100%. And it gave me great comfort to know that I had Henry King in my corner. It's my pleasure to announce today that our Cox Center War Crimes Research Office will now be renamed the Henry T. King War Crimes Research Office. As many of you would know, the office was the brainchild of Professors King and Scharf and started in 2002, and since then has provided 180 research memoranda to the International Criminal Court, the Special Court for Sierra Leone, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the Cambodia Genocide Tribunal, the War Crimes Chamber of the Ugandan High Court, and the office has just entered into a memorandum of understanding to provide assistance to the UN Special Tribunal for Lebanon. Henry's world was, even years ago, global in a literal sense, long before many of the rest of us saw it as global. And the vitality of that office, the War Crimes Office, is largely attributable to Henry. Now, I want to show you also, and invite you to look at it later when you have a chance, this photograph, which is a photograph of the Nuremberg Tribunal. And if you look at it closely, you'll find Henry in the well, but you'll also find his wife in the gallery. And this was presented to the law school by Henry's son, David, and we will hang this in an important position in the library on the second floor, along with a portrait of Robert Jackson, the chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, which has been presented to us by the Jackson Center in Henry's honor. We are delighted to have both and thank David and the Jackson Center for both of those things. And Suzanne. Thank you, David. Yes, I should have said so. I'm so glad that so many of you have come today to our school to pay tribute to Henry King. It's an appropriate thing to do. He would not, however, want us to mourn his passing. He would want us, and as we should, to celebrate his legacy and rededicate ourselves to achieving his vision of a just world, and that's exactly what we're going to do for the remainder of the afternoon. Thank you all.
Thank you, Bob. And now we're going to hear from one of Henry's former students, a case alum who is the senior counsel to Congressman Dennis Kucinich.
Hi, thank you, Professor Scharf. I am here representing Congressman Kucinich, and I'm going to read this congressional record that the Congressman read into the record from the floor of the House last May. But I do want to take this one personal liberty to say that I was a student of Dr. King's, and just I want to give this example of how he was able to just cut to the chase. He was my note advisor, and I wrote about French nuclear testing in the South Pacific in 1996 and why it was completely illegal and why there was absolutely nothing anyone could do about it. And he called me in for the conference, and it lasted maybe about 5 or 10 minutes, and he said, I want you to read the Trail Smelter case and then review the cited sections of the Law of the Sea, and I think it'll all come together for you. And that was basically all, other than the personal talk, that was the essence of what he said. And I did that, and I reworked it a little bit, and I had 3 offers for publication, including Journal of International Law, where I had it published. So I was, but he used to like to invite me to the conferences, not so much for my knowledge of international law, but to take pictures. And I did. I came to a lot of the U.S.-Canada conference and took pictures at his request. But this memorial is now in the congressional record of the United States. It was read into the record on May 21st of this year, shortly after Dr. King died. And it reads, Madam Speaker, I rise today in remembrance of Dr. Henry T. King, Jr., a renowned lawyer and great man of peace, and in honor of his dedication to his country, community, and to international human rights. Dr. King died at home on May 9, 2009, at age 89. Dr. Henry King was a distinguished scholar of international law, international trade, and international human rights. Shortly after graduating from Yale Law School and while practicing law in New York at Milbank, Tweed, and Hope, Dr. King learned about the Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson's appointment as chief prosecutor of war criminals at Nuremberg. With the encouragement of his wife, he left for Nuremberg in 1946 with Justice Jackson as one of the youngest of 200 prosecutors. As one of the prosecutors working on the Nuremberg trials, he worked on the convictions of many Nazi officials, including Walter von Brachetisch, Erhard Milch, Hermann Göring, and Albert Speer. Dr. King was deeply affected by what he saw upon stepping off the train in Nuremberg. Surrounded by the rubble of bombed-out buildings and people begging for food, he vowed at that time to dedicate his life to the prevention of war. Following the Nuremberg trials, Dr. King served as chief counsel for the Marshall Plan. Between 1961 and 1981, he was chief international corporate counsel at TRW Incorporated, the position which brought Dr. King to Cleveland. For the last 28 years, he taught at Case Western Reserve University School of Law in Cleveland while practicing law at Cleveland Squire, Sanders, and Dempsey. Upon his arrival at Case Western Reserve, he established the Canada-U.S. Law Institute in partnership with the University of Western Ontario. The Institute holds an annual conference in Cleveland, which I have had the pleasure of participating in a number of times since my career in Congress began in 1997. This year, I had the honor of addressing the conference about the commoditization of Great Lakes water. Throughout his illustrious career, Dr. King continued his activism in the struggle for peace through international law. He pushed for the creation of the International Criminal Court as a member of the international delegation in Rome to establish that court in 1998. After the delegation failed to include wars of aggression as war crimes, he continued to push for that with other delegates until they ultimately adopted a reference to the crime of war of aggression in the court statute. Additionally, Dr. King served as a member of the American Bar Association's Task Force on War Crimes. in the former Yugoslavia. He also believed that democracies which trade with one another tend to not go to war and advocate for international trade rules and statutes as another avenue toward peace. Dr. King received an honorary degree of Doctor of Civil Laws by the University of Western Ontario in 2003. In 2004, the Government of Canada appointed Dr. King Honorary Consul General for Cleveland and Northeast Ohio. Dr. King was truly a pioneer in promoting peace through international law and was cited in The Plain Dealer by David Crane, Syracuse University professor and chief prosecutor of Sierra Leone President Charles Taylor as, quote, the George Washington of modern international law, unquote. Madam Speaker and colleagues, please join me in honor and remembrance of one of the great men of our time, Dr. Henry T. King, Jr. He will be greatly missed by those in the peace community working on issues of international humanitarian justice under the rule of law. Despite his absence, his work will continue to inspire countless activists and lawyers around the world who follow in his footsteps. Professor, there's the
Thank
congressional
you.
record.
And this will go up in the library together with the other artifacts. Thank you very much. Dennis Kucinich is not the only dignitary that couldn't be here today but wanted his remarks to be read. And so Daniel Ujczo, who you'll hear from in his personal capacity later, is going to be reading something from the Consul General of Canada. Okay.
Well, good afternoon. As Michael said, I'm appearing in a few capacities today. First, on behalf of the Government of Canada, I do extend our thanks to Dean Rawson, John Antin, and Michael Scharf for the opportunity to say a few words about Henry and his contribution to the Government of Canada and the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, and certainly express our sympathy and appreciation to Henry's children, Suzanne and David. It's a bit bizarre being an American and a case alum speaking on behalf of a foreign government, but it all ties back to Henry King. And I just take a personal liberty for a moment. It was more than a decade ago that I was walking into this very room. I was a first-year law student. My first year professors had done their job. I had absolutely no social life. I was walking in here to watch a moot court practice where I neither knew the students nor the topic being discussed. And as I was walking in, my international law professor, now Dean Hiram Chodosh, said, "I'd like to speak to you after this event." And I said, and my immediate thoughts were, one, what did I do in class today? And two, now I can't leave early. But he grabbed me and said, "I'd like you to meet Professor King tomorrow at 1:30. And I went home that night a bit nervous. I talked to one of the upperclassmen and said, "What do you know about Henry King, other than that he's the Nuremberg prosecutor, legendary figure?" And he said, "Dan, I know you're late for everything. Do not be late to meet with Professor King." And so I showed up an hour and a half early in the best suit that I had, and Henry was a bit more mobile then. Some of you have heard this story, but it's a favorite of mine. And as I was sitting out there, Henry would walk by from time to time, kind of look at me, shake his head, and walk back into the office. So I was very nervous. And when I got into the appointed time came, I went into the office and I sat down, and right when I looked up, he said, "Hiram Chodosh may think you're going to be a good research assistant, but I don't think anybody that uses an hour and a half of their time just sitting outside of my office is going to do a good job." And I'm, of course, where do you go from there? But my intention was to say I would wait forever to meet someone of your stature, but it really came out as, at your age, I thought I should get here early. And as it came out of my mouth, I realized what I just said, and Henry looked at me, and I looked at him, and I thought, here we go. And he just laughed. And for those of you that knew Henry knew that he had a laugh that was just infectious. And since he's passed, we've all shed a tear from time to time. But that's the memory that I share, is that laughter, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But a few years later, I got a phone call from the Government of Canada. I had been working with Henry on the Canada-U.S. Law Institute. We had colleagues in the department, and they said, "We'd like you to come work for us." And I was excited. Called Henry, and I said, "Henry, I think this is going to work for the Institute, blah, blah, blah." He said, "Well, let's talk about it at our weekly dinner." So I went to dinner, and I was very excited. And Henry, I gave all my angles, and Henry said, "Okay." And then he started talking to me about this position, and it became very clear to me he knew I was going to be offered that job well before I did. And he had it all mapped out, exactly what I was going to do, with the limited exception that my first official assignment was to give a briefing to our honorary consuls, of which Henry was the first and the dean of the honorary consuls. So I was in Ottawa briefing the consuls on their programs and policies, et cetera. And of course, when I was finished, I turned right to Henry. I knew that was where the first question was going to come from. And I said, Dr. King, what's your question? And he said, Dan, he said, Mr. Ujczo, because we wanted to pretend like we didn't know each other. And he said, I don't understand why you're allocating your budget there. You should give it to us that actually know how to use it. And I said, thanks, Henry. And, but there were some senior diplomats in the room, and I tried to handle Henry. I gave a perfect bureaucratic answer. I hope this isn't being webcast, by the way. And I saw the group in the back saying, he answered Henry. And I thought, okay, and I went and turned to the next audience, and Henry said, I heard him laughing over to the side, and he goes, we're going to talk about that on the plane ride home. And that, of course, was my introduction to the Foreign Service. But on behalf of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Canada, Lawrence Cannon, I do extend on behalf of his statement that reads, on behalf of all Canadians, I extend sincere condolences to the family and friends of Henry T. King, Jr. Henry's passing is a great loss to those who value the rule of law. His contribution to the development of international criminal law started at the forerunner of today's international criminal tribunals, the Nuremberg war crimes trials. He served as the youngest prosecutor, beginning a lifelong commitment to end impunity for perpetrators of the most heinous international crimes. His decades-long work culminated in the establishment of the International Criminal Court. The legacy Mr. King leaves for us today goes far beyond the development of international criminal law. He was a vigorous and long-standing champion of Canada-U.S. relation. He served as the U.S. chair of the Joint Working Group on the American, Canadian, and Mexican Bar Associations on the Settlement of International Disputes. This work helped to shape what became the NAFTA. For over 26 years, he also led the Canada-United States Law Institute, which tackled and contributed to the debate around many aspects of our complex bilateral relationship. In 2004, he was appointed Canada's first honorary consul for Cleveland and Northeastern Ohio, and he was reappointed in 2007. His passing is a profound loss to the United States, and as such a great friend to Canada as well. He will be deeply missed by a grateful nation. And the Government of Canada's Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade has issued a plaque that will be on permanent display for both our current and future faculties and students, and I'll issue this as well to Michael. Thank you.
I remember something that Henry used to say as well, and that was, Michael, how are we going to teach Dan how to stay on a time limit? But thank you very much for those remarks, Dan. Now we're going to hear from the Dean of the Faculty of Law of Western Ontario, who is our partner in many things, including in particular the Canada-U.S. Law Institute, Professor Ian Holloway.
Thank you very much, Michael. Dean Rawson. In his work, the poet at the breakfast table, the great poet and scholar of medicine, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., said that it is the province of knowledge to speak and the privilege of wisdom to listen. For those of us who are interested in the rule of law, it was our privilege, our very great privilege, to have been able to listen to and learn from Henry King for so long. It's now more than 6 decades since he first emerged on the stage of international jurisprudence in the rubble of Nuremberg, as we've heard. And through his life's work afterwards, we were the beneficiaries of a wealth of knowledge, which has not only taught us much about the rule of law, but also about ourselves and our societies. As we've heard, Henry was a graduate of Yale College and the Yale Law School. He began his working life in the conventional practice of law, but it was at Nuremberg that his life, as he put it himself, was given a moral focus. And fortunate indeed we are that this was the case, because from our perspective, it's not at all an exaggeration to say that Professor King's work at Nuremberg in 1946 and 1947 represented a significant contribution to our present-day understanding of international human rights law. The link which he helped to draw in his prosecution of General Milch between the economic exploitation of people and violation of human rights norms represented a major breakthrough for our understanding of the notion of responsibility and culpability for human rights abuse. In this sense, Henry King's great service as a comparative lawyer was to remind us that the rule of law is not a monolith, nor does it wear nationalistic clothing. The rule of law is neither American nor the preserve of the English-speaking common law world. On the contrary, Henry taught us that the rule of law represents the collective aspiration of humanitarian-minded people everywhere for a means of living in peace and harmony. As we've heard, it was in 1980, following a professional career which at that stage had already extended 35 years, that Henry joined the Faculty of Law here at Case Western Reserve University. And it's at that point that a more parochial indebtedness on our part in Canada to him began. As from the beginning, Henry assumed a leadership role in the Canada-United States Law Institute, founded, as Dean Rawson indicated, in 1976 as a joint venture between the University of Western Ontario and Case Western Reserve University. The Institute's objective is to promote dialogue on legal issues of common interest between the two countries. That this objective continues to be met is due more than anything to the energy and sustained vision of Henry King. It was he who convened the Institute's annual conference, which is one of those occasions which features often in rhetoric but seldom in fact, where one gathers together not only with other scholars, but with business people, with lawyers, with public servants and politicians to debate and explore matters of common concern. Indeed, I would hazard to say that the Canada-U.S. Law Institute Annual Conference does more to facilitate harmonious Canadian-American relations, at least in the legal context, than almost anything else in which Canadians habitually take part. In Canada, we will miss Henry a great deal, but his legacy of duty and wisdom will not soon be forgotten. Finis coronat opus.
Thank you so much, Ron. Now we're going to hear from Professor John Barrett, who is the biographer of Robert Jackson, who was Henry's mentor and hero. And so it is appropriate that John be able to give us his perspectives on Henry.
Thank you so much. Henry King was my teacher and colleague through Justice Jackson in the academic and literary sense, my Nuremberg colleague for the last 8 years. 1 year ago, I had the great privilege of moderating a panel, Henry's last group experience, speaking with two of his fellow Nuremberg prosecutors, Whitney Harris and Ben Ferenz, both of whom wish they could be here and are men who have cried as we've spoken about Henry in the months since May, and that alone tells you a lot. It's a dwindling fraternity of former Nuremberg prosecutors, and it's been special to be admitted to it ex officio through Henry's friendship. I have to thank Case for this invitation, President Snyder, Dean Rawson, Professor Scharf, but I must tell you that I had already been invited to this event by Henry T. King, repeatedly. Now, he did not want this event to occur, I guarantee you that. But, rationalist that he was, he realized that there was a certain inevitability, and he hoped and assumed that his friends in this institution would do right and convene this event. And he directed me to be there and to speak about Nuremberg and about me, Henry King, and Case. And so I'm going to do that. Luckily, I was invited, so I didn't have to throw elbows to get to this microphone. Regarding the latter, Case Western Reserve University, I can make short work. Case was Henry's home. It was a place of achievements and happiness for him. It, of course, had complications and frustrations. Henry King was in midlife when he joined the full-time faculty here at Case, and he continued into, of course, old age. Only health, only mortality stopped Professor King from being in a classroom this fall. He loved the students of Case Western Reserve University, and I know some are here. I teach, many of us teach or have taught at various points, and one of the things Henry always took conversations to very quickly was the students, and then he would brag about how he had the best ones here at Case. He would talk about special colleagues and relationships. Many are in this room, and I don't mean to omit anyone, but I know Jonathan Antin, who was his suite mate for decades, and Henry would talk to me about John. Michael Scharf, whose arrival and collaborative energy in the last years. Hiram, others, meant so much to him. Henry's world was corporate, commercial, and international law. The law of modern human rights included therein. But Nuremberg, in his teaching, research, writing, and speaking, was his passion and his identity. And his time here, that sort of 1980 and forward period, was a time when Nuremberg, was still very much eclipsed by the Cold War. And when people, including here at Case, some people may have been inclined to think of Nuremberg, and thus of Henry T. King, as more of a piece of the past, even a relic, than a vital and thriving piece of our future. That frustrated Henry King at many levels, including because he always knew that his time, as against the permanent significance that he believed Nuremberg embodied, was finite. And he wanted that future, while he was still here, to be part of it. And this is going to be a happy speech. Let me turn to Nuremberg. Henry King, in his days of Nuremberg, was Harry. I asked him about that once. Why does everybody of that generation call you Harry? He said, because it's a better name, but we just kind of outgrew it, and nobody's called Harry anymore, so I go by Henry. But he was Harry King in his youth. And in February 1946, he was a young married man. He'd married Betty May Stanton, also of Meriden, Connecticut. They were living in Manhattan. She had a secret job, which he later learned was connected to the Manhattan Project. He, a graduate of Yale College and Yale Law School, was a young associate at Milbank Tweed. In that winter of 1946, he decided to leave the big machine, nothing like a Milbank of today, but a big corporate Wall Street law firm, and go out on his own in a smaller practice where he could really be a lawyer. And the Kings, Harry and Betty, had friends over for dinner on a Sunday night, his law school classmate Ted Fenstermacher and his wife Nancy. And the Kings said, "Great news, Harry's leaving Milbank and going out on his own." And the Fenstermachers probably kind of looked at their shoes and each other and said, "Well, we have some news too. Ted's going to Nuremberg to prosecute Nazi war criminals." Well, guess who won that showdown? Can you top this? I think not. Well, Ted's news at the end of that evening became Betty's prodding. And Henry would always gesture like this. She was in my back prodding me, telling me there is a world out there. We've got to be part of it. And just being a small firm New York lawyer or a courtroom New York lawyer, that's not it. And that prodding and that encouragement soon had Henry on the steps of the Pentagon. And by the end of spring 1946, had him hired to join the Jackson staff and what would become the Telford Taylor staff for the subsequent proceedings at Nuremberg. And that's Henry King, the dapper fellow in the three-piece suit, second from the left, standing on a pile of rubble in Nuremberg. His colleagues there include on the far right a fellow named Jim Conway, who I was lucky to meet. When Henry arrived in that spring of 1946, the international trial, the big trial, the four-nation Jackson, Goering, Hess, Ribbentrop trial was ongoing, and Henry was thrown right into various projects connected with that. He lived in the Grand Hotel, which was the center of Nuremberg, rehabilitated and restored by the American Army, the center of social activity, and he had a room there. He was entirely unsupervised, and that was good for a self-starter like Harry King. He found things that needed doing, and he did them well. This is him in his civilian uniform. He didn't have a military rank, but he had, of course, to pass guards and live in an occupied area, so a uniform was de rigueur. This is Henry. Here you see him on the left, leaning back and smiling, at a dinner he convened in the Grand Hotel that summer. This is a Yale alumni reunion dinner, Yale at Nuremberg, one of its oddest chapters. And the fellow in the glasses in the back left corner of the table is Justice Jackson's son, Bill. He was his father's executive assistant. He was Henry's law school classmate and lifelong friend. As a self-starter, Henry helped that trial finish, and he helped the next work get off the ground. It included interviewing some of the defendants who agreed to be interviewed about others who were in the queue to be defendants in the subsequent cases. And thus Henry, with translators and stenographers, interviewed Hermann Goering before he took his life in October 1946. He interviewed Albert Speer quite a few times in September of 1946, and that became, of course, a relationship that was renewed when Speer finished serving 20 years in Spandau, and became the basis for Henry's book about Albert Speer. In the Taylor phase, General Telford Taylor heading an American-only prosecution effort in Nuremberg, the first case in the queue was somebody who should have been a defendant in the big trial, Erhard Milch. He was the commanding general of the Luftwaffe. He was Goering's principal deputy. He was called as a witness and cross-examined by Jackson in the big trial. And the only reason he wasn't a defendant was too many of the American prisoners were already sort of stealing the limelight from the British, French, and Soviets. But Milch alone was the first defendant to be prosecuted in the subsequent proceedings. And in those 12 subsequent trials, the Milch case was the only one-defendant prosecution. And Henry King, as one of the core members of that trial team, participated in building that case, in prosecuting that case, in cross-examining witnesses, and in winning the conviction of Milch. This is the American prosecution table, and at the front right corner you see Taylor. And next to him you see Henry King, and across you see Clark Denny. And that's Milch. And you see the American prosecutors again in the background. This is Milch hearing the verdict of guilty, convicting him of war crimes and crimes against humanity for his supervisory organizational command responsibility over the use of slave labor from concentration camps in the aircraft production that kept the Luftwaffe in the air for as long as they managed to do that into 1943 and 1944. Now that's the legal dimension of Henry King's Nuremberg, but it also had a personal dimension. After 4 months in Nuremberg, Henry King wasn't alone there. His wife, Betty King, joined him in the fall of 1946 as a dependent spouse. She had to go through incredible bureaucracy from their apartment in the Bronx to bases in Brooklyn and eventually by ship, the Goethals, which crossed, and it was a rough passage, and you can imagine the seasickness and so forth. But she got there, and somehow, I never got to meet Betty King, but there's something amazing in this little anecdote. Somehow, in her weight allotment, in her luggage, she brought a Jeep. They paid $400 for it somewhere in New York, and that Jeep was their mobility in occupied Germany and elsewhere in Europe during Henry's remaining time. And they had occupation army privileges. Nuremberg was tough and it was gruesome and the evidence was scalding and the principles were high, but frankly the perks of occupation army service also weren't so bad. Once Betty arrived, Henry left the Grand Hotel and they got an apartment, a beautiful 2-room, 2nd floor, 2-balcony, well-furnished place with a maid, with a chauffeur to drive that Jeep. And after the Milch trial, which filled months and was grueling, they had some breaks and took some trips, weekends in Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps, up and down through Switzerland. I can't find a place in Switzerland that they didn't visit. Up and down Italy. And in their long marriage, which had some hard challenges, including, as has been alluded to, their late son Hank, Henry T. King III, and his special needs and education and the great expenses that were involved in his care, Henry said that he and Betty were never happier than that year, that horrible Nuremberg experience of a prosecutor as a happy husband. When he left in fall 1947, when they left in fall 1947, Betty was pregnant. Hello, Suzanne. She wrote, I love this too, that it had something to do with a weekend trip to the Zugspitze. Nuremberg for Henry King thus was about achievements, it was about participation in history, it was about high principles, it was also about personal happiness. And it was about substance, it was about law. It was about law as an alternative to war and the possibility that building on Nuremberg, that could be part of the progress that the world would make. And in the last decade of Henry King's life, that idea and Nuremberg and he became huge and relevant again. The Cold War ended, which made possible the United Nations tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda, and the Rome Conference, at which you've heard Henry played such an instrumental role, leading to the statute which was ratified by a sufficient and broad world community, not yet including this country, that created the International Criminal Court in 2002. And in Henry's words at that panel that I moderated just a year ago, he put it this way: "What I am saying is this: I am in the autumn of my life, perhaps the late autumn. I don't know, although I hope I have a few years left. As I look at it, Nuremberg was the most meaningful part of my life. I don't say that in a selfish stance. We have to sell young people on the substance. Peace is a concern of all persons who are going to be here on the planet and want a world in which weapons don't destroy men. We want men to control weapons. That's the important thing." And as Henry King worked on that substance in the years I knew him, in the many articles and speeches and presentations and legacy that he has left us. It was about those things, future and children. And thus I show you one more image. That's Henry King, and again the rubble of Nuremberg, and two small children. Spring of 1946. Henry, like all Americans in that occupation army, hated the Nazis and the Germans for what had been done. But he loved the children, of course, and he loved the future. And it's all there in that photograph. Children, innocence, hope, potential. We'll deeply miss our friend, but with his life and lessons, we are well equipped to continue Nuremberg's and Henry's and law's and what has always been the future's work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. And it is appropriate, although we're going in alphabetical order now, for the next speaker to be the first American chief prosecutor of an international tribunal since Robert Jackson at Nuremberg. It took 57 years, but let me introduce to you David Crane.
Well, it's good to be back at Case. I remember giving the Klatsky lecture here once upon a time, and I had just finished, or I was getting ready to have dinner with my good friend and colleague, Henry T. King, Jr., who was a great American lawyer. He was my friend, he was my mentor, and he was our colleague. On behalf of the 12 living prosecutors in the world, I want to extend to the family our deepest sympathy, but also our great respect for our colleague. On behalf of the chief prosecutors of the International Criminal Court, Rwanda, Yugoslavia, Sierra Leone, Cambodia, and Lebanon, they all extend to you here in Case their highest regards. And last week we had the privilege of assembling many of them who were there, and of course we read what we call the Chautauqua Declaration at the end of those dialogues, and each signed that particular piece of paper. It's a rare piece of paper. There are only 3 in the world right now, but we left a signature block empty that said Henry T. King, Jr. In memoriam. So he's also on the 3rd. He signed personally the first Chautauqua Declaration, the second Chautauqua Declaration, and he was a big supporter of that group. I came back, I flew directly from Freetown, Sierra Leone in 2004, November of 2004, and landed here in Cleveland, Ohio. And I was excited to be here to give the Klatsky lecture, but I also was excited to kind of rekindle my association with Dr. King. I'd known him professionally as a professor, and he had actually been on one of my panels back in the 50th anniversary of Nuremberg. But I wanted to sit and chat with him because I wanted to get his sense of what it was like at Nuremberg and how did he handle the horror. Because I was literally up to my elbows in blood and gore and death in Freetown, and I wanted to know how did he handle the situation in Nuremberg. And this is where I think a rare gem that those of us that really know him, he got this twinkle in his eye. I was trying to be serious, and I was interested, and Michael Scharf was there as well. And I tell the story because it is Henry King. I'm tired, kind of down, starting to unwind. I said, Henry, how did you handle Nuremberg? And he kind of looked at me and sat back and said, about 2 scotches a night. And I immediately relaxed, and we had this wonderful conversation about dealing with these kinds of terrible things. But he had that great smile and that wonderful, wonderful chuckle, which I am listening to as I speak right now. I'll just leave you with a couple of things. Henry King was a passionate supporter of the International Humanitarian Law Dialogues, which this great law school is a sponsor. and he would pound the table. The spirit of Nuremberg lives. Every time, the spirit of Nuremberg lives. And that's Henry King, too. Passing on that torch, not just to those of us who've had the privilege of seeking justice for those who've faced atrocity around the world, but also to the students at Case and the students at Syracuse and the students at St. John's and all of the universities that are moving these programs forward. Henry T. King is someone who will be a rock for all of us. And at the end of one of his speeches at the Chautauqua Institution, he looked at all of us and he said, "Reach for the stars." Thank you.
Now, you've heard from the Dean of Case and the Dean of Western Ontario. This third Dean is known as the Dean of the Trade Bar of Washington, D.C. He's also been an adjunct professor here, most recently last semester. Thank you so much, Richard Cunningham, for coming up here today.
I was introduced to Henry King, more than 2 decades ago, by a fellow who was the grand old man of international law in Washington, international trade law, and grand old man in my law firm, Monroe Lee. I was working with him to develop the trade practice in our firm. And he told me he wanted me to meet the 3 truly great men that he'd had the pleasure, the honor to work with and associate with in his career. There were Henry Kissinger, Robert McNamara, great and tragic man, and Henry King. 2 names that I knew instantly, and a third, to which I said, who was that third one again? So I met Henry briefly in Washington, and we worked on a program together in New York. And something happened to me that's happened to a lot of us in this room. You sort of fell under Henry's spell. So some people will attribute that to Henry's determination and his force of character. Henry was the quintessential irresistible force. If Henry wanted something to get done, by God, it got done. If he wanted you to do something, you might resist at first, but you ended up doing it. He wanted me to come in and work with the Canada-U.S. Law Institute. I have to tell you, at that time, having done the first of the 477 rounds of the Canada-U.S. softwood lumber skirmishes, on Canada's side, I might add, I was kind of sick of all things Canadian, and it was not one of the most attractive things presented to me. Resistance, as the Borg said in the Star Trek series, resistance is futile. But you know, it's not in the in the greater scheme of things. It's not Henry's determination, his force of will. You did things for Henry because you loved him. And I certainly came to love him. We've heard about the twinkle in the eye. We've heard about the infectious laugh. There was no one who had more empathy for you, even after having known you for a fairly short time, than Henry King did. I cannot remember a meeting, an encounter with Henry where Henry wanted to begin by talking about anything other than me. I mean, you knew that Henry looked at you and felt a bond with you, and that produced a bond that you had with him. Now, Henry has been referred to here as an institution builder, and boy, he certainly was that. And I'm immensely proud to be involved in the Canada-U.S. Law Institute because I agree. I think it's a major element in understanding between our two countries. It's also an immensely important intellectual exercise. There are ideas that are generated here that are really important. And Henry will, of course, live on in the institutions that he's created. But I think the most important way, whatever you think about what happens to a person's soul or his consciousness or whatever, for us here, the important thing about a person is that they live on in the hearts of others. Henry King will always live on in my heart. It's such a pleasure and such an honor to have known him and worked with him. It's something that I will treasure till I die.
Thank you, Dick. This next speaker, together with Henry, conspired to bring me here to Case and is responsible for me being a professor here. He was the director of the Frederick K. Cox International Law Center before me, and then an associate dean who was responsible for many of the innovations at this law school. And now he's the dean at Utah Law School, and it's my pleasure to see my old friend Hiram Chodosh.
Thank you, honored guests, dear family and friends. It is a sad and sweet moment to be back in this great room at this great law school among such great friends. Remarkably, Henry's loss leaves a deep hole in our hearts, and yet the fond and instructive memories also inspire our greatest hopes for the future. To understand this paradox, we have to reflect on why we loved Henry so much. For one, I loved the story that John told about Betty's response to the idea of 26-year-old leaving this major law firm for an uncertain trial at Nuremberg. Henry, there's a big world out there, and we need to be a part of it. I loved his quirky odd couple relationship with Sid Picker, who was the architect of the Canada-U.S. Law Institute. The two were actually decades ahead of the curve in international legal education. I even loved his Soviet-style elections for board members of the Cleveland International Lawyers Group, achieved with humor, efficiency, and somehow without any controversy. A process that could have been a lesson plan today for President Karzai. I love the way Henry combined the death-defying invulnerability of Rasputin with an untiring compassion and commitment to his work on free trade and human rights, as he never allowed his poor health to get in the way of his important work and high spirits. I recall at least on a couple of occasions in which he had major heart intervention and was back at work 2 days later, extolling the virtues of surgical cardiology and proclaiming that he never felt better and looked forward to enjoying his next Manhattan. I love the persistence of Henry at every single faculty workshop he ever attended to ask the first question, a practice I always tried to prevent, but could never resist in the end. I loved Henry's attachment to his dearest students, to the opportunities he created for them to learn and grow by his side. From Dan Ujczo's experience in the Canada-U.S. Law Institute to my own common student, Ted Theophrastus, whom he took to the Rome Conference when Ted was a rising third-year law student. I loved Henry's wide-eyed idealism, his tremendous organizing powers, and his worldwide friendships that draw all of us here today, and that drew so many leaders and experts to this moot courtroom for a conference always organized by Henry as the master conductor. Before LeBron, Henry was the first king of Cleveland. Unlike LeBron, he hustled on international criminal courts. But like LeBron, he was a professional prodigy in the first period of his career. And like LeBron, in the final phase of his life, when many would have left the game, Henry literally and figuratively knew how to take control of the fourth quarter. I don't know whether Hegel was right when he reflected that history bends toward justice, but I'm confident that people like Henry bend history. And we can each honor Henry's legacy from Nuremberg to Rome, from Canada, U.S. to the International Lawyers Group, from his leadership in the International Bar to his place in an impressive lineage of forward-looking, innovative international legal educators, from Picker and King to today's Scharf, Lipton, and so many others. We can honor Henry by learning from his rich example. That is, if we can, listen to the encouragement of loved ones to play our part in the world's most important events. If we can persist through personal challenges to work on problems larger than ourselves. If we can be the first to put up our hand to ask questions, to organize our colleagues around critical issues. If we can be the first to create new approaches to understanding and creating solutions to our most difficult cross-border problems. And in the latter stage of life, if we can take control of our own proverbial fourth quarter, while even, maybe on occasion, enjoying a Manhattan. If we can do all of these things together, we might repay our debt to Henry and help him bend the future just a little more towards our ideals, toward what is good, toward what is right, toward what is just. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiram. And now we'll hear from Henry's sweet mate, Associate Dean Jonathan Antin.
Thank you, Michael. Dave, Suzanne. I was Henry's sweet mate for 24 years. Even now, 4 months after his passing, I find it disorienting not to have Henry, often in an elegant suit and sneakers, stop in to say hello, and after looking at the color of my shirt, remark that it must be either a white-collar day or a blue-collar day. Henry had an insatiable curiosity about almost everything. If he hadn't been a lawyer, he almost certainly would have been a great journalist, because he was always asking other people questions out of the knowledge that all of us have some great story inside. But as you've heard, Henry had his own views, and he was never shy about expressing them. Hiram mentioned that at faculty workshops, and those of us who've been at the Canada-US conferences know that he always asked the first question, and it was usually a humdinger. Henry had a unique perspective. As a private practitioner, public servant, and a professor, he brought that to bear all the time. Now, what really stands out to me about those conferences that Henry organized was how tight a ship he ran. Nobody got on the program without a manuscript in hand, and for years, he kept things on schedule with an enormous cowbell. Now, at some point, the cowbell disappeared, but he found another one. And when that one disappeared, he just kept things on schedule by clapping his hands. You could hardly tell the difference. He also had a wonderful supply, an inexhaustible supply, really, of great stories. He seemed to know everyone who was worth knowing and to have worked with all of them. And yes, we heard about Betty being pregnant in Nuremberg. He did send her home to give birth, lest there be any question about whether the child would be a natural-born citizen, lest the child, in the event that the child grew up and decided to run for president. Now, in the circles in which Henry traveled, this was not pretentious, just prudent. Now, even as Henry traveled in the rarefied circles that the rest of us can only dream about, he was also a terrific colleague. Not only was he great to talk with, as many people have already said, he was always willing to provide moral and intellectual support when it was needed. For example, those of you who've been in my office probably know what's coming. A few years ago, I got cited by the university for having, quote, excess combustibles in my office. When he found out, Henry instantly volunteered to represent me, if it came to that. Now, I was obviously extremely flattered that a real lawyer might agree to represent me, and at no charge to boot. But I thought for a second, and I realized, Henry's offer, as nice as it was, clearly was not entirely altruistic. He clearly understood that if the university decided to make us all clean up our offices, that he was probably next on the list. Now, one last Henry story that illustrates his impact on the school and the enormous hole that he's left that we'll never be able to fill now that he's gone. For quite a few years, I used to organize a series of programs for our first-year students. The programs were designed to try to address some broad themes that pervaded the law and to give students some sense of what they might aspire to do. I always used to ask Henry to speak at these programs, and things always went the same way. No matter what time I went over to look for Henry, he was already down here. I'd sort of hurry to catch up, and I'd see students sort of shuffling in, not entirely clear why they were down here, seeing this older fellow and kind of wondering, what was he going to say? After the students got settled, I would introduce Henry. This was always a bit of a challenge because if I gave Henry the introduction he deserved, it would take the entire hour. But whatever I said, Henry would come bounding up to the lectern, and within a minute, he'd be pounding on the lectern, and he'd be this amazing dynamo, and the students, you could see, were just amazed that this septuagenarian or octogenarian, whatever age he was at any particular year, that he looked like he was just about ready to go out, and maybe he was 40. And this wasn't really transitory. It wasn't that he just got people excited in the program. He didn't teach first-year students, but his classes routinely filled almost instantly for upper-class students at registration. Indeed, it was a lucky second year who could get into some of Henry's classes. Now, Henry was an idealist to the very end, as we've heard, not a starry-eyed idealist, for he'd seen some of the worst things that humans can do to one another, and he helped to hold the malefactors legally accountable. But his expertise, his experience at Nuremberg motivated him to do everything he could to promote the international rule of law, and he was doing that to the end of his life. I saw Henry for the last time just a few days before he died. I knew he wasn't doing so well. I had visited him a few times, and we'd spoken on the phone fairly regularly, but I hadn't seen him for a while, and so I remember I called Suzanne and asked if we could come over one night. Even on this last visit, with his body failing, you could see Henry's mind was as sharp as ever. He asked how we were doing. He wanted to know what was happening at school. He made clear that he was looking forward to teaching his class this fall. Unfortunately, of course, he didn't make it. Now, Ian Holloway referred to Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. urged us to live greatly in the law. If anyone ever lived greatly in the law, it was Henry King. Thank you, Henry. Thanks for everything.
Thank you, John. Henry would be very disappointed in my time management skills today. It's hard to interrupt people when they're paying tribute to him, though. And I think it's because I don't have a cowbell. But we can now turn the page, which means we're halfway through our program. Unfortunately, we only have 15 more minutes left in the room. We'll stay until we finish, but what it really means is I'm going to have to ask all the speakers to really try to shrink down how much time they spend now. I know Professor John Gretzinger, our next speaker, wanted to read Sid Picker's speech that he sent. It was 3 pages, single space, and hopefully you've made copies available instead. John Gretzinger was one of Henry's oldest friends, and it's appropriate that he's taken over as our U.S. director of the Canada-U.S. Law Institute. John.
I first met Henry about 18 years ago. I'd come to Cleveland as general counsel at American Greetings, and Henry had organized this Greater Cleveland International Lawyers Group, and I would occasionally participate. Periodically, I would receive a telephone call from Henry, and I'm certain a number of you have received this call. It went something like this. Hi, John, this is Henry King. You know, I didn't see your name as an attendee on our meeting this Tuesday, and we have a very interesting program. It's really a program you can't miss. Can I put your name down? Eric Jensen and I were talking about this earlier in the day, and we agreed that there were many, many meetings that we attended that we really didn't want to attend just because Henry had called us and we had such affection for Henry. I was fortunate that he became a mentor and friend. He was always generous with his time. Typically, I'd come into his office. He said, John, come in. I just want to ask him a quick question. He said, shut the door. You know, and I always think, okay, what secrets am I going to learn now? And, you know, Henry would be free with his advice. He never had another appointment he had to rush to, and his advice was unequivocal, and as has been pointed out, Henry always had an opinion. You never question where Henry stood on an issue. I was fortunate to live near Henry, and his house was on the way into the law school from my house. So as the years progressed, I would frequently stop by his house and take him to various events and school programs. Some of his favorites involved the LLM students, our international lawyers who come in for their LLM degrees. He loved to go to the picnics in the fall and to the Thanksgiving dinner with the LLM students. Henry was intensely independent. He disliked being reliant on anybody. The bedroom in his home was up a steep and narrow staircase, and when his housekeeper wasn't at the house, Henry would negotiate the stairs on his own. So I thought, well, Henry really needs one of those escalators that goes up the stairs so he doesn't have to worry about negotiating the stairs. And I did some research and presented it to him. Henry said, thank you very much, and ignored my research, which I knew he was going to do. But, he did like his independence. I would be finally remiss in not mentioning the Canada-U.S. Law Institute. This is an organization Henry felt passionate about. About 10 years ago, he and I started an endowment fund for it to make sure it continued after Henry passed along, and fortunately American Greetings gave the initial gift. Even when he wasn't feeling well and I visited him, one of his first questions would be, how is the Institute doing? What's going on at the Institute? And in planning this year's annual conference, which Henry had a heavy hand in doing every year, his voice and advice and questions will, I'm sure, resonate in all our heads. Now, as was mentioned, Sid Picker had a very good description of a 40-year relationship with Henry, and it is out on the desk with the law journals, so you're welcome to pick it up. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Chris Hunter, who was until recently the president of the organization you've heard so much about, the Cleveland International Lawyers Group.
I'll be brief, and it's great to see so many friends here. And I just wanted to kind of start with a short story. I know everyone, is very familiar with Henry and his background, and it's hard to add anything to what we've heard today from some excellent speakers. But just this past weekend on Saturday night, I was down with my family at Blossom Music Center, which is about 45 minutes away from here, on a very beautiful night. It's an amphitheater. Cleveland Orchestra was out playing some Bugs Bunny music, which was just phenomenal. Kids were having a ball. Must have been 10 to 12,000 people there. The place holds about 8. Must have been 12,000 people there. And a very good friend of mine was there, and was there with a couple. And the woman was from India, and he introduced me, and he said, she's an attorney at one of the larger law firms in Cleveland. And she's like, oh, I've met you through the International Lawyers Group before. And I was like, I can't believe I'm here with, 12,000 people, and, someone, makes this connection. And I think that was, one of Henry's gifts, and that some of these institutions that he's created, really help us to connect with people, across cultures, across international boundaries. He's really helped us get to know people. And I was kind of laughing because gorgeous night out, giant moon. And, I was thinking, did Henry have anything to do with that, And I could see him, calling up Mother Nature and saying, like, look, I need this moon out there. Got a lot of friends coming from out of town. It's very important to me. And could you have it up by, like, Friday afternoon? And, Mother Nature obviously just saying yes, because she wouldn't have a choice in the matter. And, receiving a confirmatory letter, like, within a couple seconds of, agreeing to do this, like the speakers do. Who come to the International Lawyers Group. And I just wanted to mention, I was past president of the International Lawyers Group, and I was very proud to be because of Henry's association with that. I was president for about 7 years, and I just wanted to tell you a little bit about it because it's a phenomenal organization that he started here in Cleveland in 1974 with a good friend of his, Alan Hyde from Thompson Hine. It's a simple organization based on a few principles of just bringing a blockbuster speaker in from out of town, getting a bunch of people together from the Cleveland legal community and the business community, getting students together, and having us all meet for luncheons downtown about 9 times a year. And it's been a wonderfully successful organization for 74 to 2009, 35 years. And year in and year out, there's over 600 people that come to these luncheon meetings. We have fantastic speakers from around the country coming to Cleveland on their own dime just to see Henry again and be a part of Henry's life, catch up with him, and address this group. We have people from all the major law firms and corporations and law schools. And Michael Scharf has been kind enough to have a cooperative presentation every March, okay, which has been very successful. We've had fantastic speakers in over the years. David Crane, in fact, you addressed us one year. In a small way, we met as a board this past spring and decided, and not to take away from the name change of the Cox Center here, but we decided that the first luncheon meeting every year will be named in honor of Henry King. It'll be the Henry King luncheon, and we think it's fitting as a legacy to him. We're proud to say that Dick Cunningham, who you heard from before, is our first speaker this year. He's always been our first speaker for many years, and he really starts the year off on a positive note of the kind that we're trying to create, a personal, interesting, and intelligent conversation that we all have. And we're very happy to have someone of Dick's caliber again approach us this year. And I have to say this, September 23rd is coming up. It's the first luncheon meeting, and if I can hear Henry in my ear right now, all this stuff is well and good, but we got a meeting coming up. We need to get attendance there. It's just something he kind of ingrained in me. So, and I thought I'd end saying that, Henry's impact will be missed, but, I think from everything you've heard today, his impact and his legacy certainly lives on in his organizations that he started, and it's important for us to continue this. So, with that brief discussion, I appreciate having you here. It's great to see you, Suzanne, and thank you very much.
I think the next speaker is probably the person who Henry was closest to for the longest amount of time on our faculty, Eric Jensen.
Thank you, Michael. I think I can be mercifully brief because all of the stories that I plan to tell have already been told, or almost all the stories. Henry King and I joined the faculty at the same time in 1983, something that is memorialized in brief, the law school publication. Those in the front rows can see the picture of utter devastation on the cover. Yeah, could be the aftermath of a faculty meeting, but in fact, of course, it's bombed out Nuremberg. Maury Shanker has told me many times that when he first met Henry King, he thought that Henry was the worst name dropper he had ever met, because Henry would pepper sentence after sentence with the names of some of the most prominent people in the world, and it did it in such a way that it seemed to be self-aggrandizement at its worst. When Zsa Gabor and I were discussing U.S.-Hungarian relations. But Maury soon came to realize that Henry not only knew the people whose names he dropped, he was really friends with them. Statesmen, scholars, the Pope, well, maybe not the Pope, but Father Drynan came pretty close, and I think probably not Zsa either, although I'm not sure about that. But it seemed that Henry knew just about everyone else important in the world. Henry really knew those folks, some of whom were in this room, and they knew him, respected him, and loved him. Henry walked on a world stage, and he always aimed high. And here I was going to tell the story that John Antin told about Betty's returning to the United States to give birth, so that there would be no question about the constitutionality of the kids becoming president. I heard that story told actually at the house of Barbara Snyder, who began the proceedings today, told by Betty herself, and you could tell from the tone of exasperation in her telling the story, and coupled with the very sheepish look on Henry's face as she was telling the story, that this was an absolutely true story. As I said, Henry really aimed high, but he cared about the local as well as the global and national. He was a great citizen of Cleveland and Case Western Reserve. In fact, he was interested in everything, as you have heard. The great questioner at faculty workshops, at his own conference, having lunch with Henry. The first 3 or 4 questions were always Henry to the person with whom he was having lunch. I mean, Socrates really had nothing on Henry King. And to change the subject, and this is something that has not been mentioned before, there's no good transition here, the cutest faculty member. Well, in the minds of many, that was Henry King. I know that my wife, Helen, used to say that she thought Henry was just the cutest thing. And one member of this faculty always wanted, she used to say, to just reach out and grab Henry's cheeks. And the cheeks up here, I hasten to add. Henry was my friend for 26 years, one of my absolutely favorite people in the world, the nicest and most decent person I have ever known. And his passing has left a terrible, terrible void in my life. When Henry said, "It's good to see you," as he always did, he really meant it. And it was always good to see him too. Thank you.
One of the roles Henry played was as chairman of the American Bar Association's International Law Section, which is a huge group of international lawyers. And the next speaker was also the chairman of that section, and while he was chairman, he gave Henry a very special award. Thank you, Josh, for coming up.
Michael, thank you very much. Dean, thank you very much for having me here. I'm really honored. I'm thrilled to be able to honor my friend Henry. Henry is just a terrific guy. He was the chair of the section of international law, and he succeeded quite a number of very distinguished people in that role, such as John Wigmore. Nobody knows John Wigmore in this group, I'm sure. Charlie Ryan, Edward DeRee, and his co-Nuremberg prosecutor, Whitney Harris. And Henry, let me tell you about Henry as the chair of the section of international law. This is something that really hasn't been touched on a lot today, but Henry was an innovator. Henry was a pioneer. For instance, the section's #1 best-selling book of all time is called Careers in International Law. And it started in 1993, and it's now in its 3rd edition. Well, 16 years earlier, Henry published Career Opportunities in International Law, which was the first of its kind. And it showed how much Henry really cared about students. Henry really cared about students. When he was chair, for instance, at the ABA mid-year meeting in Austin, Texas, he had a reception for the students at Texas Law School. Unheard of at the time. In the spring meeting of the section, the same during his year, he had a reception for students so they could mingle with practicing lawyers. This was before anybody thought about including law students in lawyer activities. And now, obviously, it's a common practice. It's certainly a common practice in the section. The section has something they call pathways to employment in international law. It's presented at scores of law schools all across the country. Perhaps at Case, I didn't have a chance actually to ask Angela Benson whether they've done one here or not recently. With the Canadian Bar Association and the section of international law, and later with also the Barra Mexicana. So Henry pioneered that too. Even with that, though, I really think that Henry's crowning achievement in terms of just public policy, the section of international law is the progenitor of resolutions in the ABA House of Delegates, probably the most prolific one of all. The House of Delegates in the ABA has 545 lawyers, representing a cross-section of all the lawyers in the United States. During Henry's tenure, the House unanimously passed a resolution from the section supporting the establishment of the International Criminal Court. This is 1977. And this had previously also been rejected by the House, but this time maybe as a result of the fact that you had someone who actually had lived the experience of crimes against humanity and championed justice for those accused of such crimes. The House unanimously passed this. The House has reiterated its support and in fact supports the ICC in its current form and the ratification of the Rome Statute by Congress, and has done this 3 times since Henry's resolution in 1977. So Henry pioneered that also. I have to say my own experience as chair was really enriched by Henry. Henry was still an active contributing member of the section in 2003, 2004, when I was the chair of the section. They had added the Barra Mexicana to the working group on dispute resolution. The Iraq War was in full swing. 9/11 happened, and it was always great to see Henry. Henry was a reminder of how the rule of law had grown and prospered, and how we could actually use the rule of law in connection with all of these things. As Michael indicated, during my tenure as chair, we awarded Henry our Lifetime Achievement Award. It certainly was well deserved. Now, right after, in fact, during and after my tenure, Henry reminded me that the 60th anniversary of Nuremberg was fast approaching. And if you look at this picture, I don't know who took this picture, but it's a great picture. That's Henry King telling me that the 60th anniversary of Nuremberg is happening, and we better do something about it. Guess what? We did something about it. So we commemorated the 60th anniversary, and I want to commemorate my thoughts about Henry by ending with a quote. This quote is from Senator Christopher Dodd, who spoke on the 50th anniversary of Nuremberg. And he said, "Those who participated in the Nuremberg Tribunal deserve a special place in our nation's history. At the end of World War II, when the heinous atrocities of the Holocaust were revealed to the world, the inevitable impulse to lash out in retaliation against those responsible would have been understandable. But in Nuremberg, the hand of vengeance was steadied by the belief in the rule of law. Thus, our triumphs on the battlefield led to the ultimate triumph of our ideals." This is the legacy of Nuremberg and all those who participated in the tribunal. This was certainly Henry's ideal, and I'm very proud to have been his friend. Thank you, Michael.
Well, we've heard a lot about Nuremberg today and Robert Jackson, and our next speaker, Greg Peterson, is the chairman of the board of directors of the Robert Jackson Center in Chautauqua.
Thank you. I'll be brief, Michael, because I know the mind can absorb only what the rear can endure. To Suzanne, David, friends and colleagues, I start. David, is the red light on? Are we going now? I just had, driving down from Jamestown, New York, a surreal experience. What was that? I grabbed a CD of Henry's very special 1991 trip with his son, David, to Germany to interview Albert Speer and Frau Junge, which became the basis of his book, The Two Worlds of Albert Speer. So I'm tooling down 2 hours worth of Henry King talking in my ear, David working the sound system, and they're having this wonderful interview with Albert Speer and Frau Junge. What insight. It was remarkable. And it was just a magic moment for me because it harkened back to the beginning of a relationship between Henry King, Robert Jackson, and this fairly newly formed Robert H. Jackson Center, which was created in 2001. We're up in Jamestown, New York, and our mission is to advance the legacy of Justice Robert H. Jackson. And we wanted to do something special our first year, 2001, and we wanted to focus in on the Nuremberg Trial, of which you heard much. And we started musing. In fact, one night I mused with a fellow Chautauqua Institution board member named Marty Coyle. Marty Coyle was general counsel for TRW, and he said, "Hey, a guy that used to work at TRW, Henry King, you need to know him because he was at Nuremberg. He can be a participant in your event." I didn't know Henry King from Adam, but I went home, did what anybody would do, called directory assistants. I called Henry King, I introduced myself, and I said, "Would you be willing to participate in the first ever conference at the Robert H. Jackson Center?" And the quick answer was yes and hell yes. And here are some people who you should call immediately, and we did. So off we went. 3 days later, in my mail was an outline. And then there was a call that said, "Greg, will this do? What else do you need to know?" And here's how I would suggest we plan this. Ultimately, through the moderation of Professor Barrett, Whitney Harris, Bernie Meltzer, James Conway, all came to the Robert Jackson Center, and this became a C-SPAN moment, all kind of directed in front of and behind the scenes by one Henry King. We got off to a wonderful start at the Jackson Center. 2 days later, I get a call from Henry King saying, or I get a letter from Henry King saying, "Hey, that was wonderful. Thanks so much for participating. And by the way, I have a suggestion for the Robert H. Jackson Center. Perhaps you should have a seminar entitled The International Humanitarian Law Dialogue." Now, David Crane's here, and David Crane has been the impetus behind 3 of these now up at Chautauqua. Henry was many years ahead of this, David, and I found the letter just yesterday. We were slow on the uptick, but I'm glad he gave us that inspiration. He felt closely akin to the legacy of Robert Jackson, and I'll tell one quick story. It was an event here, and we were invited down, and Michael did one of his big dog and pony shows, and there was lots of people, and Henry was the principal speaker, and we came and we presented to Henry as a thank you, a portrait of Robert H. Jackson here at this particular event. And he was very grateful. He put it up in his office. Now, here's the real story. Shortly thereafter, Michael tried to see if he could have Henry donate that portrait to Case. And the answer was no and hell no. It was Henry's, and that's the way it was going to be. On behalf of the Robert Jackson Center, there are so many firsts that I'm thrilled that Michael asked me to come down and participate, because I must tell you that there's a close relationship, Case Western, Henry King, Robert Jackson Center. Henry was our first Law Day speaker the next year, our first webcast, our first major event at Chautauqua Institution, where he spent 3 days talking to a elder hostel group, and I brought a bunch of these down because this became our first publication, Henry King's Reflections on Nuremberg. It was remarkable. He was our first senior advisor. He was our first speaker at the Robert H. Jackson birthday celebration in Warren, Pennsylvania. He's the first guy on the Robert Jackson website. I interviewed him. He was the first interviewee. He was the first on YouTube. I might add, if you go on YouTube and you type in Robert H. Jackson Center and you scroll down and you look for case number 2, what you'll see is you click, you'll see 2 shots of Henry King at Nuremberg. It's sort of cool. And he was closely aligned, of course, with several who were fellow colleagues at Nuremberg. On a more serious note, when Henry passed away, there was a letter from fellow Nuremberg colleague Whitney Harris, and I would like to read that. In all that he accomplished in his lifetime, Henry King put the destiny of his country first. He gave every measure of devotion to America and its noble purpose to lead the world to peace, freedom, and democracy. Henry King has helped to make America a stronger nation and the world a safer place for humanity. I salute my lifelong friend, Henry King. That was from Whitney Harris, who is 97, and I talked to him today, and he sends his regards and memories of Henry. Finally, Henry was a participant in the first and the second International Humanitarian Law Dialogue, and as David mentioned, the fact that he signed in memoriam, we left a blank space for him at the third. But his final remark and his final sentence of the second International Humanitarian Law Dialogue was this: You have got to keep your eyes on the stars, live on hope, and keep idealism about the future. We have a special responsibility because we are a free society, a society where dreams can become reality. We have the American dream, which becomes a reality in the business world. Let the American dream become a reality in the international world. To David, Suzanne, the red light is on, and his legacy continues on through all those he touched. Thank you.
And Greg, I forgot the story of the portrait because you then sent us a second portrait, which is now hanging up in our library, and thank you for that. The next speaker is one of Henry's prides because it was his first student to follow in his footsteps and go work at an international tribunal. We now have 5 case alum working at international tribunals. We've placed 30 case students as interns at international tribunals, but this was the first, Christopher Rossi.
Thank you, David and Suzanne. And Michael, Henry would say, you came all this way, speak your mind, don't be brief, but I'll try to be brief anyways. I always looked to Henry as a mentor. I first met Henry when I was an undergraduate student, not a law student. I was 18 years old and was recruited to participate in an international humanitarian law moot court competition called the Jean Pictet competition. And I'm sure Henry at the time said, what does an 18-year-old know about international humanitarian law? But that didn't stop him from really becoming my personal tutor in preparation for this competition that was taking place in Malta. He really brought the law out of the books for me. He explained, he guided me and explained in detail his fascinating life in international criminal law. I immediately realized when I started working with Henry at this period in 1998 that I was really learning from a legend. And in 1998, here he was, traveling to Rome, lobbying for the inclusion of the crime of aggression in the statute of the International Criminal Court, and he was teaching me. And it was really something that I never forget and really formed my desire to continue in law school. He was so eager to hear about my experiences when I returned from Malta, and he remained very curious in my growing involvement with this organization over the years. In 2001, he was honored when I asked him to be the opening speaker at this moot court competition that was being held in the United States for the first time. He was a perfect person to open the event and address the 100 or so students from all around the world because they were in Cleveland to discuss the laws of war. And Henry showed them firsthand how moral authority and the rule of law can affect positive change. And despite his unparalleled achievements, Henry really loved being part of new adventures. And for years, he kept talking about the mix of cultures that he met while taking part in the Pictet competition. In particular, he could not believe that a Russian team was composed of both Japanese and American law students. Isn't that something? That's wonderful, he often said to me when reminiscing about this experience. And he encouraged me in all these endeavors because he really enjoyed and appreciated international law and relations. He never lectured me. He served as a constant reference on the practice of law, which continued upon my return from Malta, throughout law school, in private practice, and during my time as an international criminal lawyer in The Hague and in Tanzania. My most poignant memory of Henry, though, is from during the summer following law school, when we drove together from Montreal to Cleveland. We covered 600 miles, and the drive lasted about 10 hours. Over the years, I had worked with Henry on the Canada-U.S. Law Institute, and he asked me to accompany him to receive the Canadian Bar Association President's Medal to be awarded in Montreal by his good friend Simon Potter. We planned to meet at the hotel right before the reception, most likely for a Manhattan, and I have some bad news for all of you. Henry did tell me at one point that I make the best Manhattan. The day was Saturday, August 16, 2003, and most of you from the Great Lakes region will remember this is around the time when chaos hit Niagara, the blackout of August 14, 2003. Henry was unfortunately en route from Cleveland to Montreal via Toronto at that time. And due to the power outage, it became apparent that Henry wasn't going to make it in time for the beginning of the banquet because all flights from Toronto were canceled. I didn't know what to do. There I was, in my tuxedo, Henry's guest, sitting at a table with Canadian legal and political luminaries, including the Chief Justice of Canada, and I sat there, not knowing how to accept Henry's award, and saddened that he could not be there to accept it. People were saying great things about Henry. It was sort of a polite roast, and I thought to myself, Henry should really be here to witness this. After dinner and the first round of speeches, dessert was served. And I glanced across the room, the Oval Room at the Ritz-Carlton in Montreal, and saw a figure moving between the tables and hugging and greeting people, all the way up to the front of the room. And I couldn't believe it, but Henry had made it for dessert. I don't know how he made it or how he had the energy to show up after spending the whole day in the Toronto airport, but he did, and was ready to address the audience and receive his prize, but only after he had his dessert. I leaned over and said, "How are you?" And he replied, "What did I miss?" And I explained the wonderful speeches and all the great things that had been said about him. Then he looked at me and said, "No, what did they serve for dinner?" Understandably, Henry wanted no part of Air Canada for his return to Cleveland. He wanted to drive 10 hours with me instead. It became a truly special Sunday. We talked about life, his regrets and his greatest accomplishments. He told me about his involvement with bar associations and other organizations and that promoted legal cooperation and development. and his love of both international trade and humanitarian law. Two topics that were becoming my love at that time as well. We talked about my career as a practicing lawyer, which was just beginning a few days later. We discussed what he saw me doing in the short and long term, and how I too could form a lasting impact on institutions of both my countries, the USA that I now call home, and Canada where I was born. That became the first of many conversations I had with Henry about my career and the role of lawyers. He was a trusted advisor to me. He wanted me to dedicate my career to the rule of law and was so happy that I too had this travel bug and the desire to promote the work of international cooperation and institutions. Most importantly, his guidance was not unique to me. He was a role model for young lawyers and it gave an extraordinary amount of time to helping the younger generations. This past Easter, I spent an afternoon with Henry at his home in Pepper Pike, having one of our regular discussions about life and work. I took the opportunity to ask everything that was on my mind, such as, what is your biggest regret? By the way, he responded with one word, Milbank. And his voice stays with me as I tackle tough questions. And I know that Henry has given me a great foundation for the rest of my career. And because of Henry's encouragement, guidance, and friendship, I will, as Henry always said, keep dreaming and strive to be the lawyer that Henry always said he saw in me.
Our next speaker is the second of two distinguished figures in this room who have received our Klatsky and given the Klatsky lecture. Eli Rosenbaum, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, heads the office in the Justice Department that used to be known as the Nazi Hunters, and now their portfolio has expanded to be Rwandan genocide and Cambodian genocide and Yugoslav genocide.
You're taking my time.
So go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you, Michael, Suzanne, Dave, Dean. For many years now, one of the very first things I see each morning when I arrive for work at the United States Department of Justice is an 8 by 10-inch black and white photo. You actually saw it here before during John Barrett's presentation, of a not quite 28-year-old Henry King seated at counsel table next to Brigadier General Telford Taylor on April 16, 1947, as the judgment convicting Field Marshal Erhard Milch of war crimes and crimes against humanity is about to be announced by a U.S. military tribunal at Nuremberg, Germany. That framed photograph occupies a place of honor on the wall of my office in the Criminal Division's Office of Special Investigations. Framed right next to it for more than a year now is a second 8 by 10-inch print, this one a color photo showing Professor Henry King, by then 89 years of age, chatting with me in Chautauqua during a break between sessions at last year's International Humanitarian Law Dialogues. The sight of those two wonderful photographs provides me with enormous inspiration, literally on a daily basis, as my colleagues and I continue to work to secure a measure of justice on behalf of the victims of Nazi crimes against humanity and victims of more recent atrocities from Rwanda to Bosnia and beyond. As it was for Henry King and his colleagues at Nuremberg 60-plus years ago, the work is extremely difficult, both, one might say, technically and also emotionally. And just as it was for Henry King and his fellow Nurembergers, the work requires a determination, indeed almost superhuman perseverance. That last requirement was perhaps most notably demonstrated right here in Cleveland in OSI's decade-long effort concluded just this past May to remove former Nazi death camp guard John Demjanjuk from the United States. However, the perseverance and tenacity that the women and men of OSI brought to that case was surely dwarfed by that which Henry King and his Nuremberg colleagues brought for more than half a century to the battle to realize their dream of achieving the establishment of a successor court to the International Military Tribunal, a permanent international criminal court. Henry never gave up when fighting for a noble cause, even one that, like the ICC battle, seemed to be nearly a hopeless quest, decade after long and fruitless decade. And if continuing the struggle required that Henry get on a plane, say in his 9th decade of life, and fly all the way to, say, Rome, Italy, to apply his great moral authority and prodigious intellectual and persuasive gifts in person, well, so be it. That's precisely what he did. Never give up. That was the message that Henry King communicated whenever we met. He understood from difficult personal experience the challenges and frustrations inherent in human rights law enforcement work, and he never failed to inquire about the status of the Damiano case and our other prosecutions. He cared deeply about the cases and especially about the victims. Through his words and through the example of his amazing life, Henry always succeeded in bolstering my spirits and in recharging my prosecutorial batteries. In my professional life, there surely could be nothing better than an attaboy from Henry King. Oh, how I will miss those warm expressions of encouragement. Henry's many extraordinary contributions to international criminal law during and after Nuremberg, and his passionate and tireless dedication to the pursuit of justice on behalf of the victims of crimes against humanity made him without doubt a pioneering and towering figure in the history of the worldwide human rights movement. And he inspired so many people. I will never forget being in this room, I guess it was 2 years ago, one of the wonderful programs that Michael and the Cox Center put on here, and Henry was speaking. And there were a number of us in the room that were moved to some tears by what he said and how he spoke. But seated next to me was an African, I believe, LLM student who was weeping. And I had to console him. I had to, it was an amazing experience. Henry had that effect on people. I think it's important to note that Henry's stellar service at Nuremberg, both at the first trial, in which he assisted Justice Robert Jackson before the IMT, and then in the subsequent proceedings before U.S. military tribunals, and after that, his work on the Marshall Plan, all of that was performed as a federal public servant, that is, an employee of the United States government. To those of us in federal service today, and I guess I'm today's representative of that group, those of us who pursue justice on behalf of the victims of human rights violations, Henry King is a magnificent role model. His accomplishments remind us of a time of far greater confidence in public service and in public servants as a force for improving the world. In a commencement address last year, then Senator Barack Obama encouraged his audience to enter public service. Quote, "At a time of so much cynicism and so much doubt, we need you to make us believe again," he said. Friends, Henry King was a member of that fabled greatest generation whose myriad good works surely made us believe again. Accordingly, it's especially on behalf of Henry's countless admirers throughout today's legion of federal public servants, and particularly on behalf of my colleagues at the Department of Justice, that I want to extend heartfelt condolences to Henry's loving family. And more than that, I want to express abiding gratitude for Henry King's exemplary and remarkable service to humanity. If, as Michael said last week at this year's Humanitarian Law Conference at Chautauqua, the age of impunity for international criminals has at last been replaced by an era of accountability. That historic result owes in no small part to this gentle but persistent man who battled indefatigably and against very long odds for a world in which, as he liked to put it, the law of force would be replaced by the force of law. Henry King never gave up, and for that, humankind, and especially imperiled peoples the world over, must be profoundly and everlastingly grateful. His example will continue to inspire all of us. Godspeed, Henry.
Thank you, Eli. And Eli mentioned our LLM students. Together with Luke Katz, our next speaker, Adria Sankovic, runs our LLM program.
I don't know how I can follow all these great speakers, but I wanted to say a few personal things. Professor Henry King was really a very dear friend. He was a dear friend to me. He was a dear friend to my family. And, we were friends for almost 19 years. Now, he started out as being my boss. And I remember very well my interview at the law school. I was told, "Oh, Professor King, you will enjoy working with him. He's an old world-class gentleman. He's very fatherly. He's very easygoing. But he does create an awful lot of paperwork." And I didn't know what to expect. I was so excited about all the work he does and so forth. And sure enough, I soon found out that Henry kept meticulous memo to files on every little activity that we did. So on one hand, we'd be working on, his speech or his book or, some really fabulous project. And then Henry would come out with a stack full of notes that he wanted, transcribed. And this was all before noon, So between 9 o'clock and noon, he had already spoken to maybe dozens of people and gave me all this stack of little notes to do. So I thought, well, okay. I had to take my daughter to high school a little bit earlier. I'll come to work a little bit earlier, and I'll try to catch up with all this work. Well, when Henry saw that I was coming to work a little bit earlier, sure enough, 2 days later, he was at work at 8 o'clock, And I thought, oh, okay, we got to get going. We have lots to do, And indeed, we always had lots to do. And in those days, we didn't have the computers we have now. So, we worked hard and accomplished a great deal with very little staff. But those were the exciting days at the law school. We were just starting the International Law Center, and as the programs grew, I eventually moved on to more administrative position. But of course, Henry and I always stayed very good friends, and he would ask me from time to time to help him with other projects, which I did, outside of the school. But, one of the things that we remember so dearly, my daughter Diana did her senior project on Nuremberg trials, and she put together an interview and did a video, and quite recently she told me, Mom, so many years after I did that video with Professor King, my world history teacher has been showing this to the students. So, indeed, this legacy that Henry left us, lives on in so many small places. And that these children have been exposed to this great man, and I'm sure he will be always remembered. When Professor King passed away, my family and I, we really feel like we lost a member of the family. And the other impact of Henry's work, I want to say, is that, my family and my old folks that are still with us, they're 89, 90, 91, well, they lived through World War II, and they still talk about it. Might as well have happened yesterday, We had an uncle who was in Auschwitz. We had an aunt who was taken to labor camp in Austria as a young girl, And my husband's hometown was destroyed by the German army in April of 1944. I mean, they were receding, but the war was still going on. So his work had a great personal meaning to us. Now, all those, memo to files that we used to put together and type and file, and they're all sort of scattered in all the recycling bins throughout the law school. And I was so sad when Dan was cleaning out Henry's office. But certainly, Henry will always stay in our heart, and his memory will never be forgotten.
Well, we're down to the home stretch here, and Dan, I promise to keep my remarks to 3 minutes, if you will, as well. I wear several titles and several hats around here, but the one that I'm going to be most fond and proudest of from now on is Director of the Henry King War Crimes Research Office. It'll be great to have my work and his name always spoken together because he was such an impact in my life. We're putting together a book. Tom Renz, who's a student, has been helping to assemble a book that's based on the series of brown bag lunch lectures that he gave in his last year, which Dean Rawson mentioned. And in addition to those, because the text is only about 100 pages, we're going to be adding additional text. And so anybody who spoke today or anybody else who's here in the room or who cares to add something about Henry's life, we'll add that to the book. The last year of his teaching, I followed him in room A54 across the hall, and he had a little microphone, and it was a wireless, and there was a big booming loudspeaker, and sometimes he would forget to turn it off as he left the room. And so we would start our class, and then I would hear him having conversations, and his voice was coming from up there. And so I'd have to run down the hall and say, Henry, turn off the microphone. I think in many ways, Henry was not someone who would have seen the movie Austin Powers, but if he had, he would have thought of me as sort of his mini-me, if you know the reference. And so, Henry, if your microphone's still on up there, let me say it is my honor to carry on your legacy, my good friend.
I'll be extremely brief, but like John Barrett, Henry and I talked about this event on really only one occasion, and it was the one time in his life we had a secret that we kept for a number of years, and he said today would be the day that I could tell it. Everybody always asked Henry, how do you do it? How at 89 do you stay this vivacious and vibrant? And it was quite obvious. It was through his weekly dinners with people like Dick Petrie and Ron Lott, and then his colleagues on the Consular Corps, and certainly Roy Knapp, and his morning meetings with Deborah. He would also just, from time to time, he would go to Christmas parties or the TRW reunions, and he'd come back really refreshed the next day, and I'd say, how was it? And he'd say, I saw the woman so-and-so, and she gave me the biggest kiss on the cheek, and he'd have this schoolboy look on his face. But over the years, we would always debrief and have a cocktail or two at various travel locations. And I remember vividly our time in Nottingham, England, and we would end the night always with a nightcap, and he would go off, and Nottingham's a college town, so I would go exploring. Sure enough, at 6:30 the next morning, we'd have a breakfast meeting with Henry, and I'd walk in, and he'd go, Dan, did you see Robin Hood last night? Because we were in Nottingham, and I'd say, no, Henry, I didn't. And then he'd get this schoolboy devilish look, and he'd go, well, did you at least see the Maid Marian? And then we'd all laugh. But if you heard much about Chautauqua, and I thought of this last week when I was driving there, that they were my favorite times to travel with Henry, and he would talk about the event. Henry always had an agenda, when you would meet with him. But we would casually get to a point where we would talk about just the issues of the day, and it was almost like having a child in the car. He'd say, isn't the foliage beautiful, Dan? How many deer do you think are out here? But on one particular occasion, he said, Dan, have you ever tried New York wine? And I said, no. And, we're in the middle of the vineyards on Interstate 90. And then we just went on and talked about something else, and a few minutes later, Henry says, Dan, I need a health break. So we stopped and pulled off and filled up the tank of gas. Henry did his business, and as I looked up, I realized we were sitting across from one of the wineries, and I said, Henry, here's your chance if you want. Winery, kind of joking. And he said, I think we should. And I said, whoa, time out. Suzanne won't like this. There's medicine involved in all of this. And he goes, like that. And I said, look, I'm not going to tell an 80-something-year-old man what to do. So we have course go, and he tries, and everybody in the winery loves him, and it's this infectious personality. And as we're driving away, it hits me like a ton of bricks. I said, you knew that winery was off that exit, didn't you? And he said, yeah, I saw the sign back there. And we laughed for about 15 minutes. If somebody drove next to us, you would have thought we were two lunatics, but we were just laughing and laughing and laughing. And Henry gave one of his most impassioned speeches at the Jackson Center, or at the Chautauqua Institution that day, and it was our long-standing joke that whenever we had something important to do, he'd say, Dan, get a bottle of that New York wine, and it was a figure of speech. So I had forgotten the story. We had done it so often, I had forgotten about it. And on my last meeting with Henry was at his home, and we were talking about my upcoming wedding, and he swore, he said, I never thought I'd see this day. And one of the last things he said to me, Dan, is he said, remember to always stop, no matter how hard you work, but always stop and have a glass of that New York wine. And I took that to heart, and as I was walking away, Henry being Henry, and he said, that should be a commercial. How do you think we can sell that? And I said that, and that's my memory that I'll always take with me, is not only to preserve his legacy, but also to take time and remember what we're living for. Thanks.
Those of you who were close to Henry knew that he used to talk all the time about his children, who he loved so dearly and he was so proud of, Suzanne and Dave. And thank you both for being here today. I used to ask him what Dave did, and he said, oh, he's writing the great American novel. And after a couple of years of hearing that answer, I thought he was making a joke. But in fact, Dave came out with the great American novel, The Ha-Ha, which won so many awards and has done so well. So he was right, and it was in the genes. Dave, it's appropriate for you to end our session today, and then afterwards, we'll all mingle down the hall for some drinks in Henry's honor. Dave?
Wow, what a beautiful afternoon this has been for Suzanne and me. We miss our father very much, and you've brought him back to us through your memories and your stories and your imitations and your tears. And although I have to say, Michael, that Dad would have been delighted that this ran so long. My God, Dave, Michael couldn't get them to stop talking. In the interest of expedience, though, I have so much that I want to say to those of you who've spoken before me. But in the interest of expedience, I'm going to stick to my very brief prepared remarks and hopefully have a chance to share something with you at the reception. So this is what I prepared. About 2 years ago, my dad called me in Brooklyn, New York, to say that Professor Michael Scharf and Dean Gary Simmons had invited him to deliver a series of informal autobiographical talks here at the law school. These are the brown bag talks that you've heard mentioned earlier. Dad was enormously excited by the project, which he saw as a dual opportunity, first to engage the students in a way that was more intimate than the customary classroom dialectic, and second, as the first step in the projected memoir that Dad had long contemplated, but never quite settled down to write. My father delivered the talks in the winter of 2008, and he was delighted with the response. Dad's love of the law school's student body was intense, and each week he'd call me with a kind of morning-after review in which he'd crow about the students' interest and enthusiasm, the depth of their curiosity, and the perspicacity and braininess of their many inquiries. The memoir project, though, languished a bit. There were issues with transcribing the audio tapes, for one thing, but I think another reason for the delay may simply have been Dad's preference for engaging the present and the future rather than the past. It was one way he remained young. So I can't tell you how touched I was when I learned recently that a team including Michael Scharf, Eli Rosenbaum, Tom Rentz, my sister Suzanne Wagner, and undoubtedly a bunch of others had taken on the job of resurrecting and transcribing those tapes, working as much as possible with Dad during his last months, and had recently produced the manuscript that Michael just mentioned. I speak of this incident because it's typical of the loving and supporting community that Dad found here at Case Western Reserve Law School. His quarter century at Case formed only the final chapter of a very long career, but I can say without reservation that it was among the most joyful in a professional life that was in general unusually happy and fulfilled. Dad had always enjoyed mentoring young lawyers, but here at Case that enjoyment became a vocation, and one had only to visit a class to sense the excitement and enthusiasm he found in teaching. Dad was lucky in living long enough to see many of his former students make their own marks on the broader world, and he took tremendous pride in watching as a generation of young women and men made the shift from being his students and became friends and colleagues. Likewise, one had only to stroll the halls of this building with him to realize that here was a realm where Dad was blessed in his associates. I don't think it's likely that when Dad arrived here in 1983, he made a decision to stay virtually the rest of his life. But I think it is clear that he stayed because he found a home. The kinship that Dad discovered at Case was one of the great satisfactions of his later years, and the work he did here constitutes his last great adventure. Furthermore, the environment of respect, friendship, and congeniality that the law school community provided prompted Dad to develop attributes, a gift for teaching, of course, but also an interest in the kind of purer legal intellection common in academe that had perhaps been underused in his earlier government and corporate lives. As my sister pointed out just the other night, at Case, Dad found a medium that allowed the very best of him to flourish. He had so many friends here, his fellow professors, of course, but also a long series of kind and devoted secretaries, as well as guards, librarians, maintenance people, and even the nice audio technician who tenderly pinned him with a microphone before each class session. I wish I could thank you all by name, but once I got started, I would stand here all evening, so let me thank you as a community. Likewise, today really belongs to those in Dad's field who have so skillfully addressed his professional legacy. So let me just say how deeply appreciative we are of the many opportunities for fulfillment that Dad's tenure at Case Western Reserve Law School provided him, for the kindness and stimulation he found here, and of course for the kind words and honors bestowed on Dad today. It's deeply fitting that the name of Henry T. King, Jr. be associated with a school my father loved and with a center whose work he deeply believed in. On behalf of Suzanne and me, and our late mother and brother, and most of all, on behalf of our late father, who would be profoundly moved, thank you all.
Please now join us for a reception in Henry's honor just down the hall in the rotunda.